In this lecture, we're going to talk about lawyers or attorneys. As you know, they're a very important part of the legal system, and they are also a major presence in our culture. In fact, we have in the United States 70% of all the lawyers that live on earth. Um, the number of attorneys at one time was actually increasing faster than our population. So in the US right now, we have about one lawyer for every 300 people in the United States. We also know that a high proportion of our policymakers are lawyers. Those of who, in Congress, in the governor's office, at the state legislature, many of those people are attorneys. And it is considered one of the higher status jobs in this country. Being an attorney, being a doctor, is considered fairly high status. Now, in terms of the presence in our culture today, that was not always the case. During the colonial period, for example, when our country was first getting started, there were very few attorneys in our country, and actually, there were no law schools in our country at that time. In fact, during this time, if you wanted to be an attorney, what you had to do was go to England and go to one of the law schools that were already established in England in order to learn the law. There was also an apprenticeship model in this country. So what you would do is you would train with a lawyer who is already a lawyer in this country, pay him a fee, and I say him because there wouldn't have been any female lawyers at that time. You'd pay this lawyer a fee, and that person would train you how to be a lawyer. And during this time, each state had their own system for accepting lawyers. And as you might guess, it became a real crazy quilt of rules and laws in terms of becoming a lawyer. Now, despite the early problems, in becoming a lawyer, lawyers were beginning to have an impact in America. If you look at from the Revolution to the mid-19th century, by the time we get to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we had 56 signers, and 25 of them were lawyers. So from the beginning of our country to the time when the revolution started, you can see that the numbers of attorneys and their prestige in our society had increased. After the revolution, obviously the number of lawyers increased. Law schools were finally established in the late 1700s. Harvard Law School, it wasn't the first to be established, but it was the first to become fully endowed, and it became the model for all other law schools. During this time, from the Revolution to the mid-19th century, lawyers and people who went to law school came from very well-to-do families. So it was not something that you would expect blue-collar kids or middle-class kids to aspire to. One other thing that I want to mention about this period is the method for teaching law was born at this time. And it was Harvard Law School that the Socratic method was born. We're going to talk more about this later. In the 20th century, the American Bar Association became much more active. It adopted their canon of ethics. And during the 20th century, there was a dramatic increase in the number of people that wanted to study law. And what you saw for the first time in the 20th century is women and minorities who wanted to study law. So you've got a more diverse population. So let's take a look at the profession today. We have a lot of attorneys in our country. About 60% are in what we call private practice. 16% of that 60 are in what we call solo practice, working by themselves. 10% are involved in corporate law, some are in government, some are teaching in law school. But one of the things that we are seeing is an increasing specialization and stratification. So we have attorneys now, for example, who specialize in, for example, environmental law, energy law, family law. So we're getting more specialization and stratification as well. Within the law profession itself, we have different types of law firms that you're likely to see attorneys employed in. At the very top, there are our top tier elite law firms. These are law firms that usually employ 200 or more lawyers. Most of those lawyers are associates, which means they're the bottom rung. These people, they're attorneys. They work very, very long hours for the firm. At the end of 8 years or so, the firm may offer an associate partnership. And what that really means is that you've made it. You're going to be a partner at the law firm. You'll not have to work such long hours, and you'll share in the profit. Most of the attorneys that work at these kinds of law firms won't make partnership. And what they'll do is they'll spend 8 years at the top tier law firm, and then they'll go someplace else. And by the way, they'll be very well trained, and there'll be lots of firms that will want to take these associates. But basically, it's sort of a training ground for other law firms. At the next level is the large national law firms. They are just a notch below the elite, and they'd probably hire the associates that don't make it from the top tier. They often, these large law firms often serve as attorneys for large corporations. The next tier down is the small firms. Most of the attorneys in the country are at this level. These are firms with 20 or fewer attorneys, and as you might guess, the salaries are lower. And finally, there are those that are in private practice. And as I said before, they don't make up a large percentage of the population, but and they probably make the lowest amount of money of all the different groups of lawyers that I just talked about. So let me just show you a little bit of information in terms of the salaries that attorneys make. And what I have here is a map that shows the distribution of salaries across the country. As you can see on the left side here, these are the salaries, the salary marcations, and there's some wide variations between the bottom and the top. And what you can see if you look at a map of the United States is that these salaries are not evenly distributed across the population. You can see that those making the $145,000 to $192,000 are right here on the West Coast, and you see them also on the East Coast, and you see Atlanta, okay, Dallas area. Those are the places where you're likely to see the opportunities, but that's where those top tier firms are. If we look at the state of Wyoming, you can see here that for the vast majority, in the north especially, are making what, around 65 to 85,000. You see the higher paid lawyers down here in this corner, which makes sense because that's where our seat of government is. Now this data is from 2009, so I'm sure the salaries are quite a bit higher, but I just wanted to show you that they're not evenly distributed across the country. Now attorneys make what I would consider at least a fairly decent salary. However, one thing you need to consider is that many attorneys leave law school with tremendous school debt. Let me just show you what we're talking about here. In order to go to law school, it takes about 3 years, and the cost of law school can be anywhere from $16,000 to $43,000 per year. And multiply that by 3 years and you can see where the debt will pile up. I found this handy little law school cost calculator. For those of you that are interested in possibly going to law school, here's a nice calculator that can help you determine which law schools you can afford and, of course, how much money you might need to put away. So there's the URL up there for any of you that would like to take a look at it. But what you do, let's take a look here. First of all, let's make our living situation, we'll live at home, making it the cheapest of possible ways to live. And here are all the law schools. So let's go down to the University of Wyoming first. University of Wyoming. And calculate. Okay. As you can see, if you were to go to the University of Wyoming this next year, it would be $13,203 every single year for 3 years for a total cost of $63,743. And that's a lot of money. But Wyoming is not one of the more expensive law schools. Let's, for example, go to one of the most prestigious law schools, Harvard Law School, here. And look at the tuition here. Now, mind you, this is how much it would cost to go to Wyoming. Let's calculate the total cost for Harvard. $227,000. So just think of attending one of these types of law schools and the type of debt that you might accumulate by going to these law schools. So becoming a lawyer then is quite expensive, even though you may hope to earn a fairly decent living when you get done. What I'd like to do now is turn and look a little bit at what actually happens and how we train lawyers. And let's take a look at law school training. One of the things that we know is that law school is known to be extremely taxing, the kind of training that they do. And that's because they use a special method of teaching that's called the Socratic method. And what law? There's a discussion of cases, actual cases. What are the underlying principles of the case? What are the critical factors of the case, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I have also is a small video that is a more modern video of law school students describing the Socratic method. And again, I think it gives you a little bit of a flavor for what it's like to actually be under that kind of questioning. So let's take a look at that.
The Socratic method essentially entails the teacher calling on a student and questioning that student, and through his questioning of that student, A, humiliate the student, and B, let the rest of the class know what the correct answer is.
I had a professor who was really hardcore about the Socratic method.
And he'd yell at us and jump up and down, and he had a cane.
He doesn't even put it down before he points into the class. He yells, "Mr. Chen, please recite the facts, procedural history, and the holding of so-and-so case."
Basically, they put you in a pedestal and screw you to the wall and, make you sweat in front of the whole class.
You'll see people their faces turn bright red.
You can just literally hear the fear, the shaking of their voice when answering the question.
You will feel like you are underwater and you are never, ever coming up.
It was a very terrifying experience, and people just sat very quietly and very still and waited for the professor to just scream out someone's name and then grill them for up to 40 minutes.
It's bingo.
You're trying to hide behind your computer monitor. You're just trying to sit on the edge of your seat to where your head is being blocked by the person in front of you so the professor can't see you.
And, maybe there's that freak of nature out there that says, oh, I hope she calls on me because I am so extremely prepared. But I know that the rest of us, we're just thinking, oh gosh, please let her call on somebody else.
I find that it's a rush and it's fun, and going head to head with a brilliant professor is unlike anything else.
I personally love the Socratic method because it forces you to read every single night. It forces you to be diligent.
The Socratic method is nothing but scare tactics to get you to read and get you to study. And in that way, I think it works very well.
I had one professor who called on someone who just flat out wasn't prepared. He said, I'm sorry, I haven't read. And you could see that it was almost a personal offense to that professor.
I had to pass one time, and it was pretty scary.
Passing entails a degree of shame that even if you don't really know the answer, you probably want to give it your best shot.
If you weren't prepared, you better make something up, because the unacceptable answer was, oh, I haven't read today.
Better that you bullshit and pass.
There's no bullshitting. You cannot bullshit your way through a Socratic thing. You either can give a coherent answer, or you might as well just say, I'm sorry, I just don't know.
The entire point of Socrates using the Socratic method with Ekman was that he wouldn't ask his students answers because he didn't think he had the answers. And then Socrates always said, I don't have any answers, that's why I only ask questions.
In a lot of schooling, growing up, you're told what to think. You're told what the answer is, and you memorize the answer, and then you spit it back out on a test. In law school, you're taught how to think, how to come up with things on your own. They ask questions, they don't give answers. They change the hypothetical in the middle of it. They change the case in the middle of it to keep giving you more and more questions.
And really, if you pump out a couple of correct answers, usually they move on to the next sport sucker. Because they want the person who doesn't know the answer to sweat.
A professor realizes that you don't know the answer and just says, the hell with it. I'm going to stay on this guy and make him keep giving me wrong answers until everyone in the class realizes what the right answer is because they've heard every wrong answer.
Here's the answer. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, I just changed. Oh, it's over here. No, sorry, changed it again on you. You're never gonna get the ball.
And you go from being confident in your knowledge of the law to feeling like a schmuck.
Yeah, you're going to be wrong in front of 80 or 90 people, but if you're one of these people who feels like you always have to be right, you can't say something unless you're sure, the Socratic method might be a little difficult on you.
Yeah, if you can't accept failure, law school isn't the place for you because you're going to lose. And you will learn more in your losing than you will ever know by winning.
Ask me how many questions you want. I mean, the ones I get right will be the ones I get right, and the ones I get wrong are the ones I get wrong. And at some point, you know, you'll choose to move on to someone else. And if you choose not to move on to someone else, that's fine too, because in the end, you know, my grade is just what's on the final. So I can say whatever I want to say.
Sometimes they'll be playful with it, sometimes they'll seem mean and stodgy with it. Just go with it.
At first, people maybe be a little intimidated by him, but pretty soon it was almost funny, you know. He'd be yelling at someone, we'd be laughing.
Don't worry about it. You'll get a black letter outline for that. You'll figure it out in your study group. You'll learn the process and enjoy it as it goes. Hide the ball can be a lot of fun for you too.
So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how law school students describe the Socratic experience. As you might guess, and as some of the students that describe their law school experience, they talk about the fact that it can be very stressful. But most of the information we have about the law school experience is anecdotal. It's not research oriented. Students, especially students in their first year, talk about experiencing significant anxiety and depression during that first year of law school. One of the biggest things that they bring up are, you know, time pressures. There's just no time to do anything. They're working all the time. Here's a little quote that was from a first year law student. "There's no time for me. All I do is ingest. Prime of life spent huddled in a library carrel. But I'll be a lawyer, so I go on." So again, the time pressures being mentioned a lot. I have a short little video too that I found on YouTube that is from that was written by a law student, and it's a little song. It's a little ditty. I think it's kind of humorous, but again, describing that law school experience as being very stressful. So I just want to share it with you.
Used to think I was smart till I came to law school. I used to sleep at night till I came to law school. I used to have a life till I came to law school. I thought I was the shit, now I know I'm not shit, thanks to law school. I can't stand when I see friends and family and they ask me how's law school, and I have to say something besides it's driving me crazy, and the work is endless and the stress relentless, and my arguments defenseless, and my choice of profession was senseless. Yeah. You know, I used to have a sense of humor till I came to law school. Never used to hear voices till I came to law school. I never had gray hairs till I came to law school. I thought I was the shit, now I know I'm not shit, thanks to law school. And it's 1 is hell, getting by on the cheapest shit the liquor store sell. This one L, life is hell. All I own are mashed potatoes and a broke ass Dell. And this one L, life is hell. For everything I learn, I forget something else. And this one L, life is hell. Made me a shadow of my former self. And they say it gets better, but the damage is done. I bleed reasonableness and jurisdiction. The cases are scripture, outlines are Bibles. Professors are preachers, and friends are my rivals. And for now, no one will hire me, and if they did, they'd soon fire me. But I guess I'll be happy when I'm a retiree, cause right now I'm broke and my checkbook's my diary. If you got cash to spare, could you please wire me? I'll pay you back when I pass the bar and leave law school.
There you go. Kind of humorous description of the law school experience. As I said, however, most of the information that we've had about law school experiences has been anecdotal. However, I had a former student who was interested in getting some data as to whether or not law school is actually more anxiety provoking than other kinds of professional schools. And this was a study that was done by my student, Matt Dameyer. And he wanted to look at anxiety and depression among law school students and compare them to another group of students who were also undergoing some training. So what he did was he compared law and medical students, and he measured them. He had them do a scale, an anxiety scale, a depression scale, and then asked them to write a description of their first year experiences. So simply just, like write everything you can about your first year experience, what has happened in the first year. Another thing he wanted to do is not just compare law students to medical students, but within law schools themselves, there are two types of law schools, and many publications will assess whether a law school is considered a low quality law school or high quality law school. And what I mean is, I don't mean the quality of the teaching, but quality of life schools. So for example, some of the law schools, like Harvard is one of those that is low quality of life. Some law schools admit 100 students knowing full well that, 65 of those students will not make it after the first year. And they'll even tell you things like on the first day, look to the left, look to the right. Two of the people will be gone, so we're going to get rid of, 2/3 of the people next year, and only those people will go on. High quality of life law schools only admit the number of students that they want to keep. The way that there's pressure against, the time pressures, the kinds of classes can create either high or low quality of life school. So what Matt was interested in is whether or not there was a difference in anxiety and depression that you could see in the high versus low quality of life schools. So what he did was he had law school students and medical students had volunteered for his project. And like I said, he basically looked at their scores on a depression scale and an anxiety scale and looked at their description of their first year experiences. And what he did was he used a software program that looks at the words that people use in their descriptions. And what he was interested in was the extent to which you use positive words and the extent to which you use negative words to describe your experiences. So let me just show you the results of his study. So this is law school students versus medical students, their depression scores, their anxiety scores, and the extent to which they use positive and negative words in their statements. And here's the results. As you can see pretty clearly that the law school students had much higher scores on the depression scale and the anxiety scale as compared to medical students. And you would expect medical school to be somewhat stressful. Also, when he looked at the kinds of words that people use to describe their experiences, you can see that the medical students use more positive words to describe their experience, more than law school, but not a whole lot more, but certainly more. But the law school students use far more negative words to describe their experience. So right there we have some of the first data that says that some of the anecdotes are true. What a law school students are describing is in fact true of a sample of law school students. Well, let's take a look at the quality of life issue. Again, remember, he's comparing low quality of life law schools to high quality of life law schools. And what I did was in this next graph, I've included UW as a separate category, just so that you could get a sense of how it fits into the low and high quality schools. So here's the results from the low and high quality schools. As you can see, as you might expect, those schools that fit into that low quality of life, the students experience significantly more anxiety and depression than the high quality of life schools. And you see UW kind of is a little bit higher than the high quality for depression, a little bit lower in anxiety. In terms of the number of positive words, the students in the high quality schools use more positive words to describe their experiences than the low quality of life schools. And again, the pattern of results are the same when you look at law school quality of life. So what we have here then from Matt's work is some data to support the idea that law school students as a group are more distressed than other professional groups. Of course, we can't say anything about causation here because this was not an experiment, it was a correlational study. I mean, it's entirely possible that law schools are very distressing and cause depression and anxiety in the students. But the alternative explanation, of course, is that maybe people who are highly anxious and more depressed are attracted to law. So we can't tell for sure. But it does seem that at least when you compare the high versus low quality schools, it does seem, quality of life schools, it does seem that there is something about the law school environment that causes distress. Now, obviously, in that little video that I showed you, and in some of the anecdotal information that we see, law school students expect that once they get out of law school, things will be much better. But in fact, some of the data doesn't suggest that's true, and in fact suggests that some of the stress continues once they get out of law school. I have a quote here from Chief Justice William Rehnquist, sort of cautioning lawyers not to sacrifice some of the other parts of their life. So Justice Rehnquist says, lawyers who work harder to make partner, to earn more money, and then tell themselves that they don't have time now for family and friends are on a very slippery slope. They may think they're only postponing the opportunity to be a better parent, a more loving spouse, but in fact, they are sacrificing that opportunity. This quote suggests that some of the stress that you see in law school continues once attorneys go out into the real world. And in fact, some of the few studies that we have that look at attorney job satisfaction do suggest that some of the stress that you see in law school continues once they get out. So for example, this is a fairly old survey, but in 1992 they did a survey. It was a national sample of lawyers, and they found that 75% of the attorneys said that they would change careers if they had the opportunity. In another survey that was in 2000, 65% said that they were planning to switch jobs within the next 2 years, and 25% of that sample was going to leave law altogether. So this suggests that at the very least, some of the distress that attorneys describe in their law school experiences do not end once they go out into the real world. So what I've done here in this lecture is just give you a little bit of an idea of the attorneys not really looking at what they do in the legal system, but their training and their importance in our culture. We'll continue to look at some of the legal players in our next lectures. Thank you.